Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third and final day of our Alliance Conference. Welcome to all the participants joining us from across the OSC region and beyond. And welcome to our panelists who will join us in just a few minutes for our fourth panel, which will be on recommendations and the way forward. Before we begin, a few technical announcements. Once again, please ensure that your microphone is muted and your camera disabled at all times, except when you are taking the floor. Interpretation is available in 6 languages. Should you have an issue with interpretation or any other technical issues, Zoom participants can contact the ICT host via the chat. Participants on Zoom and here in the room at the Hofburg can register to take the floor to make short interventions and ask questions to our panelists. I know we already have several folks signed up, so I would move quickly if you would like to reserve a spot. Registrations for taking the floor are recorded with our colleague Alexander Kirilenko behind me and present in this room, or by sending a chat message to floor request. In order to allow for sufficient time for a fruitful discussion, interventions from the floor should be as brief as possible and not exceed 2 minutes. The speaking list will be closed when the maximum number of interventions has been reached, or at the latest 30 minutes before the start of this session. Please also present interventions in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner, observing the time limit and focusing on recommendations related to the topic of this session. Zoom participants can also address their questions to the panelists via the chat function. And now we will kick off this panel with, once again, a video from one of the survivors who has lent us their voice.
Hi, my name is Kira Dobek. I'm the Executive Director for Washington Trafficking Prevention, located in Tacoma, Washington, in the United States of America. I got into this field as a result of my own experience with being sexually exploited. And I wanted to really pass along all of the help that I finally got when I exited the life to somebody else. There are a number of things that I could talk with you about today, but I want to hyper-focus on your role in people's recidivism back into the life, but also your role in prevention and in justice. As a disclaimer, I've been incredibly privileged with my court experiences, and they were still incredibly traumatic, financially disastrous, and emotionally debilitating. A lot of the requirements that I had from my court interactions were impossible to achieve with the circumstances that I had going on in my life. It was not due to the fact that I didn't want to achieve the requirements. I was unable. A little bit of background of my life that is by no means abnormal for survivors at all, but I think gives a little bit of a glimpse into all of the extenuating circumstances that people just like myself experience. My life from the age of 4 to 20 years old was filled with things like incestual child abuse, physical abuse, neglect, poverty, domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, and sexual exploitation. At the very young age of 6, I began using substances to cope with things like depression, PTSD, suicidal ideation, and crippling anxiety. It wasn't until 22 years old that I had my very first interaction with law enforcement for driving under the influence. And unfortunately, what the court, treatment providers, prosecution, and even my public defender, because I could not afford my own attorney, saw was somebody who was guilty of driving under the influence. What everybody failed to see was how many times I tried to get help when I was younger and begged teachers and school counselors and friends' parents and even members of my own family for help, and nobody helped me. What they didn't see is that I couldn't afford to go and get counseling, and so I was doing the best that I could to cope while supporting 2 small children and working a very menial, low-paying job with crappy health insurance. The truth is that the system that was supposed to support, protect, and serve justice failed me miserably. And so did all of those other systems that the court system interacts with. As a result of losing my job after receiving those charges and all of the legal and financial obligations that I had, I ended up back in the life very shortly thereafter. And in July of 2013, I almost died as a result of still not getting the help that I needed at the age of 26. I would ask and I would beg all of you sincerely, please assess the capabilities of those that you prosecute and exact your judgment upon. Do they have the ability to access transportation to treatment and court and counseling and advocacy? Do they have a job that enables them to survive, i.e. pay rent and put food on the table while paying astronomically high court fines? Could they do community service in lieu of court fines? What does justice really look like? How does racism and white supremacy impact your sentencing? Why are some people seen as a perfect victim while other people who are of a different race or maybe trans not receive justice for their exploitation experience? Please, please, I'm begging you, please serve survivors. We need you and we need justice. We deserve justice.
Well, I'd like to thank Kira Dobek and all the other survivors who have joined us during the course of this conference. And we're not quite done. We have another video towards the end, but they're calling on us to fulfill our role in ensuring that justice is delivered to victims. And I think Kira really wonderfully outlined the numerous challenges that victims face and how those challenges are compounded when they are criminalized on top of that, and how that can really stand as an obstacle in the way of their recovery and their access to assistance. It's a powerful message and one that I think is relevant to all those who work in the criminal justice system. She highlighted the heavy responsibility that we all have, and I think policymakers, lawmakers, civil society, and citizens, all of us have in one way or another a duty to try to end impunity and to help people like Kira. They need us and have placed a tremendous amount of faith in us to support them and to fulfill our responsibilities. And therefore, it's time for us to listen to that call. This panel is going to try to help guide us forward on that mission by outlining recommendations on how laws and policies and practices can best contribute to increased and more effective prosecution, but also prosecution that is, I think, humane in how we approach these issues and think about where and when justice can be delivered. The objective is to highlight innovative ways to address the challenges mentioned in previous panels and to enhance the implementation of the Palermo Protocol that, once again, we celebrate the 20th anniversary of this year, as well as relevant OSCE commitments. So with that, I'm going to turn to our speakers, and I remind all of the participants online that the biographies of the speakers can be found in the materials related to the conference. So I'll keep the introduction extremely short, but first, I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Miria Vasiliadou, an independent expert from Cyprus and former EU anti-trafficking coordinator, and I can say somebody who I had the privilege of collaborating with for a couple years during my time at the OSCE, and I was Very grateful for her strong advocacy on the field of human trafficking. Dear Miria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for the invitation. Special thanks to the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator. Can I take a moment to congratulate you for the event and congratulate all your team behind this effort? I know that it's been a mammoth task. Congratulations on your excellent work and visibility. Indeed, it's been a pleasure working with you for the last 2 years. I have worked in the area of trafficking for over 2 decades. And the last decade, I've had the privilege of a leadership position that allowed me a bird's eye view, if you like, of the situation in the EU and globally. I'm here to talk in my personal capacity, but I think it's consistent with what I've been saying all along during the last decade. I have talked often about the culture of impunity and the trafficking chain. I am pleased to see that both terms are now widely used, and I'm very pleased with the topic of this conference. But what is this culture of impunity? We know what impunity is, but it is a culture that tolerates the fact that potentially tens of thousands of girls and young women are trafficked for sexual exploitation at any given time, with the crime tolerated, if not normalized, by society and the criminal justice system alike. And what about the trafficking chain? We just heard from a victim. It's a chain of actors involved for this serious crime to take place. It could be from relatives involved in facilitating the children becoming exploited in another country, all the way to the abuser that rapes them. From a man who owns the local sweatshop manufacturing cheap clothing to the vast profit maker of the large chain store in our cities, and potentially many of us who buy these products while turning a blind eye. The trafficking chain includes the perpetrators, the profit makers, the exploiters, the users, the abusers, and sometimes the buyers. Any criminal justice approach that treats trafficking in a restricted manner is bound to fail. And I'm conscious I'm in a panel of prosecutors, all but myself. That is, any process that focuses solely on the trafficker, or indeed only on the victim, fails to holistically address the culture of impunity and the trafficking chain, because it fails to address the driving forces behind trafficking. What are the driving forces? They are the profits and they are the exploitation. And as we see with all the statistics presented by Val on the 20th of July and the other speakers, such an approach is in fact failing. Using the same tools for combating trafficking as we use for all other forms of organized crime simply is not enough. On the 19th of June, so a month ago, the executive director of Europol commented on the COVID-19 crisis. We know that there was a surge in online distribution of child sexual abuse material. Let me quote her. The economic slowdown related to the pandemic may stimulate an increase of child abuse material produced within vulnerable communities for economic gain. Similarly, in the widely read book, some say Sapiens, Harari says that the slave trade was a purely economic enterprise organized and financed by the free market according to the laws of supply and demand. I was reading this last week. So from historians to law enforcement officials, it is agreed that trafficking continues to be based on the same laws of supply and demand, the economic principles behind profit. Diverting attention is also not enough because it fails to address the issue at stake. Such factors make victims vulnerable, but they don't cause trafficking. Such factors do not make a man pay to rape a woman. Some individuals appear to be willing and indeed eager to exploit vulnerable people for either the sake of substantial profit, cheap products, cheap and easy sexual abuse, sometimes knowingly so. Ladies and gentlemen, successfully addressing the culture of impunity needs our commitment at different levels. Yes, we need to do more to ensure successful convictions. Yes, we need more interagency cooperation. Yes, we need better use of financial investigations. However, we also need stronger and more meaningful means to prevent the crime and to provide a true disincentive that will eventually break the trafficking chain. It seems to me more and more that only by addressing demand, we can truly prevent the crime. Only by addressing demand, we manage to make the crime less profitable and less attractive to traffickers. All this is fundamental because our objective is not to have impunity simply to secure convictions, but to ultimately ensure that the crime is not committed in the first place. Given this logic, given my experience, here is what I consider as a way forward. First, existing legal instruments, and especially the Palermo Protocol, but also the Council of Europe Convention on Trafficking, need to be ratified and fully implemented by all. I see absolutely no need for additional legal instruments on trafficking per se, or any changes in definitions of the crime, regionally or internationally. To the contrary, there is a clear need to do our utmost to preserve these instruments, ratify them, and implement them to the full. And they should be accompanied by appropriate budget allocations. Although the international community and individual countries have taken good legal and policy steps, we heard some of them in the last 2 days, the phenomenon doesn't appear to be decreasing. We need to ask hard questions on the reasons. We need to follow up on what has been achieved or not and why, with what budget and with what results. We need to follow up on commitments. Despite the legal framework, we continue to fail on implementation and enforcement. We need to deal with the systematic efforts by various stakeholders with clear vested interests to normalize this crime. We must ask that although trafficking is often a form of organized crime, it's so much harder to achieve results. We heard the OSCE Special Representative the first day tell us about the lack of results. Why is it that despite access to financial information, we have so little to show? It seems to me that if an approach seems to work less effectively, we need an additional approach. We need something more. And this is where my second recommendation comes in. We need legal instruments to complement the current legal framework, and we need to criminalize the use of a victim of trafficking. In this context, all forms of exploitation cannot and should not be treated in the same way. Paying for forced sex, ladies and gentlemen, is not paying for strawberries by the street side. Forms of exploitation vary, and criminal proposals must address this. The supply and demand relationships is complex and one that has been thoroughly analyzed and explored. Some steps have been taken towards criminalization. The priority, this is my recommendation, must be the criminalization of users of services of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation. Why? It is a main form of exploitation. The user comes into direct, physical, and intimate contact with the victim. And the way to do this should be clear and easy. We have examples from countries and studies that are available and we can learn from. Special consideration on children must be incorporated, but we should not leave aside the users of adult victims of sexual exploitation, which appear to be the majority. We heard the victim at the beginning of this session, from 6 years old to 22, from child to adult. All the above is achievable. The obstacles are not legal and they're not moral. Worryingly, they seem to lie on financial and political motivations. Let me give an example. Why is trafficking for sexual exploitation no longer on any agenda, really? An agenda, ladies and gentlemen, is not speeches. I've been working on this for 20 years. I know what a speech is, and I know what an agenda is. An agenda is budget, programs, campaigns, advocacy, and political will. It incorporates the dimension of gender. It acknowledges that the vast majority of victims for this form of exploitation are women and girls. It leads to more prosecutions, very importantly, to more convictions and less demand, less supply. My third and final recommendation: any further approaches or tools need to be treated with cautions. Recently, recurring terms and concepts such as collateral damage, labor exploitation, modern slavery, commercial sexual exploitation, all in the context of trafficking, are unclear, and they're heavily loaded politically. Such attempts dilute and mix up a severe form of often organized and profitable crime, such as trafficking, with other phenomena. Here's my recommendation. Ask why. With what purpose? What is behind it? The definitions and concepts in the existing legal framework are clear, and we should insist on using those and only those, unless we have a specific reason to suggest something additional. I close. Ladies and gentlemen, from political leaders all the way to grassroots organizations and across political groups, there appears to be broad agreement, more or less, on what needs to be done. To achieve any impact, it's important to have an open debate. Open, I stress open. The main consideration must be what benefits the victims and prevents the crime. We have the facts, we have the knowledge, we have the instruments, legal or policy ones. We have the tools. We have all the tools to prevent the crime from happening in the first place. We have the tools to address demand and supply. What we need is very simple, yet very complicated at the same time. We must stop talking about them and get them done. And to do that, we have the most difficult part. We need leadership, courage, and vision. If something, I have done this for 10 years, and I can tell you that if something is prioritized politically, it can be achieved and it can be overcome. We have seen many recent examples of that. If something is clear in the law and policy, and the political will to ensure it is implemented and presented, then it can be achieved. There are many opportunities at the moment coming up at the regional and in the international level to see this happen. If we once more fail to achieve this political will to get things done, basically, we are failing the people that have become victims of trafficking and that can become victims of trafficking. And we're failing the victim that we just used for the presentation of this panel. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, dear Maria, for that comprehensive view of how to combat human trafficking, including by addressing the entire chain down to and including the user who is fueling the system with money, as well as emphasizing the political will and need to implement. And with that, I will turn to our second panelist, Mr. Farouk Rufov, Deputy Head of Preliminary Investigation Department in Tajikistan. Mr. Raufov will make his presentation by video address, but I also want to note that he has joined us, and I want to thank his contribution and recall very fondly my meeting of him in Tajikistan, where we discussed some of these very issues. So we're delighted to have him join us today. With that, could we play the video?
Distinguished participants in the conference, would like to thank all of the organizers for holding this event. I am sure that our joint efforts will produce results. Colleagues, in Tajikistan, the president, Emomali Rahmon, has often noted the need to tackle human trafficking and has pointed out the task that it's the task of all of the law enforcement agencies to combat this. And it was on the initiative of President Rahmon that in 2014 and 2013 and 2003, in fact, in 2003, we criminalized human trafficking, and in 2004, we passed a law against human trafficking, and this has been in effect since then. Now, in Tajikistan, we have ratified all of the various international legal acts, and we have also concluded bilateral agreements in this area too, with the destination countries. The Interior Ministry in 2000 set up a special unit to combat human trafficking, and since 2005 we've had a committee in place also against human trafficking, and they have drawn up a list of the activities that constitute human trafficking and carried out a large amount of work in this area. Also, the prosecutor's office under the general prosecutor has also undertaken a large amount of work, has conducted many different activities in the human trafficking area. As the deputy head of my department for these last years, I have also been working for 18 years, in fact, in this sphere, and so I would like to share some of our experience. First of all, we held a number of seminars, a number of training activities for our personnel, and we identified some gaps here, including we had no training materials in this area. All the materials that we had were in different languages, and so what we did at the first was to translate materials by Shushkevich and others in this area, and then under one of our prominent academics, we set up a group which also involved people from the prosecutor's office, and over the course of 3 months and all throughout the country and the courts and the law enforcement bodies, we studied this. We studied all of the material that we had on human trafficking. Then the second stage of our work was to gather all of this material together, to process it, and then on the basis of this to put out our own materials. And so we have published these 3 handbooks, which you can see here on the screen, on combating human trafficking. And we provide these handbooks to the students, to the prosecutors. After this, we also produced 2 films. I wrote the scripts for the films on addressing human trafficking, particularly sexual exploitation. And I'd also like to share some of the recommendations that I think could be useful at the regional level and even at the international level too. It could be useful for other participants in the conference. First, little studied area is our experience in human trafficking, how we in Tajikistan, how we see the trafficking process. And this requires a more thorough study of the processes taking place and the prevention efforts in this area. Second, if we have this more thorough study of trafficking, we can then use this to add to our definitions of trafficking and our efforts within the country to address this. For example, our Article 106 of the Criminal Code involving minors and begging. And then to finance the social rehabilitation of trafficking victims. This requires establishing a state fund to support the victims of trafficking. Fourth, we need to ensure that there is a proper implementation of all of our referral mechanisms. our practice shows that with the victims, we see phenomena such as the Stockholm Syndrome, we see various traumatic phenomena, and this is something that we need to address. Also, we need to take all possible measures to identify the factors that contribute to child trafficking. Now, as we know, in Tajikistan, children are usually trafficked for the purposes of unlawful adoption. But under our criminal provisions, there is criminal liability if this is done for gain. If this was simply a simple handover of the child to someone else, not for gain, this is not a criminalized act. And so we need to establish criminal liability for the handover of children in this kind of situation, even if it's not for gain. Then we need to have specialized groups working with within the prosecutor's office and within the Interior Ministry, so that these would be groups working specifically with these types of crimes. Seventh, we need to conclude agreements with other countries who are involved in the trafficking processes. This for us is, for example, Pakistan, India. Eighth, we need to have joint investigative teams so that these teams can conduct operations together. Ninth, we need to have measures to combat prostitution and also public measures to raise public awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rafouf. A fantastic set of recommendations, including specialization in prosecution, bilateral agreements, joint investigative teams, implementation of referral mechanisms to support victims, including social support. Really a great list. But one of the items that I found most interesting was this effort undertaken by you and your colleagues to really study and assess the law in Tajikistan, to try to understand it, harmonize it across the jurisdictions, and really analyze it for gaps. A fantastic example, I think, for other participating states about how to understand the implementation across a country where there might be multiple different interpretations. So thank you so much for that contribution. I turn now to Ms. Beatriz Sanchez Alvarez, a prosecutor from Spain who serves in the State Prosecutor General's office. Ms. Alvarez will make her presentation in Spanish. Ms. Alvarez, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this excellent initiative and for having invited me to take part as a speaker in this event. My presentation will look at an experience that I think could be interesting in terms of international cooperation against human trafficking. It's about the work that we have in putting in place a Nigerian liaison magistrate in Spain. This began in March 2019. We think that it's very important to look at this case, this type of work, and this could be a good basis for initiatives in the future. Now, as you know, Western and Central Africa face numerous challenges related to transnational organized crime, especially human trafficking and migrant smuggling, and also money laundering, which encourages all of this, and corruption, which exists in these countries. This has very negative consequences for the countries of origin, transit, and destination. We have to remember that the countries of destination are mostly in Europe, and Spain and Italy are the main gateways due to their geographical location. And this creates a situation where it's only possible to effectively combat these types of crimes linked to transnational organized crime if we have international cooperation. We need to work together to take measures and develop tools to improve this cooperation. At the same time, you realize the importance for this in cooperation. You have to realize that in Spain, most trafficking victims are trafficked for sexual exploitation are Nigerian women and children, practically 40% of the identified victims. And what's more, the Nigerians also constitute most of those convicted and investigated. And so here we have the Promise project, which supports the deployment of 2 Nigerian liaison magistrates, one in Italy in 2018 and one in Spain, who was appointed in 2019 on the initiative of Spain. And this is under the provisions of the UNTOC and the protocols, relevant protocols. The main powers and the activities of the liaison magistrate are to establish direct communication between the central authorities in both countries and to provide information on the structure and the modus operandi of the Nigerian criminal networks, so that the Spanish authorities will have a better understanding, the investigators will have a better understanding, those responsible for investigating and prosecuting the crimes of these networks, and also to send records and copies of the court proceedings to the authorities in the other country and guarantee prompt action on requests sent from the central authorities. Also follow up on requests, formal requests, mutual legal assistance, and also legal advice, legal assistance for the Spanish authorities so that we can have a better knowledge of the relevant Nigerian laws so we can be able to properly draft and execute mutual legal assistance and extradition requests and ensure that all of this will be effective. Now, this cooperation is taking place through the immigration unit of the Spanish prosecutor's office, and it organizes periodic meetings where all of the different actors can take part, all those who are involved in investigations, so that we can look and see if we really need this kind of cooperation with the country of origin. I'd like to give some examples of the cases that we're working on now. One case is the Cheval case, where we're investigating a criminal organization that comprises at least 25 people. They're all Nigerian, and we've identified 10 victims. They're also Nigerian, and 2 of them are minors. These are women and children who are recruited in Nigeria through deception and then brought to Spain and other parts of Europe and forced into prostitution because they have to pay back debts that they contracted during the migration process, and they agreed to these debts by taking a voodoo oath. And one of the main traffickers, one of the main people in this organization, went back to Nigeria before being able to be detained in Spain. And so we put out an international arrest warrant and a European arrest warrant, but we had no result, because what you need to remember is that we don't have a bilateral extradition agreement with Nigeria, and we couldn't directly apply the reciprocity principle. So what did we do? We worked together with the liaison magistrate, and we decided to send to Nigeria the records of the proceedings concerning this individual, send all of this to Nigeria so that this individual could be put on trial in Nigeria under the provisions of Article 21, 16.10 of UNTOC. Now, this is similar to what happened with another case that we have, the Reina case, where we also sent information to Nigeria so that the crimes could be tried in Nigeria. This is and the Nigerian liaison magistrate has played a very important part in this. Has told us that what we sent has already been received by the embassy and is going to be sent on to the relevant authorities so that the case can be tried. Another important case is the Torrevieja case, where, again, the liaison magistrate worked to ensure that we could obtain the handover of a Nigerian national who was being investigated in Spain for trafficking, and the extradition did go ahead in this case, But in this particular case, the person concerned was actually willing to come to Spain, but we needed to have the liaison magistrate take part of all of this. Now, what can I say to sum up this experience, which is still ongoing? We've got positive aspects. We've got direct joint work between the police, the civil guard, the specialized prosecutors, and the magistrates. And we've got this direct channel with the country of origin. And this also gives us a smoother exchange of information between the authorities in both countries, in Spain and in Nigeria. There are also negative aspects because the Spanish judges and prosecutors don't have a lot of trust in the procedures actually going ahead, the international arrest warrants, the extradition requests. Also, it's a very slow system because we send these requests through the diplomatic channels. And finally, there are delays with subsequent proceedings in Spain itself, because you have to remember that here we have these very big cases, they're very complex, and here we have to spend time deciding what to send to Nigeria, translating everything, and this creates problems for us. Finally, I'd like to share with you that what all this shows is that we do need international judicial cooperation to ensure that no one who has committed such a serious crime would go unpunished, and also to protect the victims and their families, and to ensure effective investigation, financial investigation, to track down criminal assets. Also, we need to better understand the Nigerian legal system, the legal systems in the countries of origin, to be able to put together joint investigation teams, for example. So as proposals, recommendations, we need to have a faster system for sending cooperation requests and transferring legal proceedings. We've got these very slow systems in place. We need to use new technology here. We need to have online systems, for example. We also need to work on putting together joint investigation teams who could be working in the countries of origin and in the countries where the legal proceedings are taking place. And also to have consistent training for the judges and the prosecutors, and international cooperation and in trafficking. And we need to have regular meetings also, multilateral meetings such as this, and also bilateral meetings with the authorities in the countries of origin and with people who have the relevant powers in these areas. And we need to have a real commitment by the institutions and the countries to make a greater economic effort also to ensure that all of this can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alvarez. Really fantastic presentation, and thank you so much for outlining the experience of Spain working on these cross-border cases, which I think we've all come to appreciate the fact that trafficking doesn't respect borders of any kind. And this creates a lot of problems, as you just so very clearly outlined. Fantastic example of cooperation by embedding Nigerian magistrate in your teams, sharing information, sharing expertise. I can't tell you how many times I've visited countries and had prosecutors talk to me about the challenges around mutual legal assistance. And clearly that's an area that needs some attention, and I appreciate you highlighting that for all of us. I'm concerned about how what this is going to look like as more and more cases go online, and the evidence for the crimes resides in servers in yet a third country. How are we going to establish these cooperation agreements? So this is clearly an area where we need attention. Thank you so much for your good recommendations. With that, we turn to our final panelist, Mr. Sergiu Rusu, head of the anti-trafficking section within the General Prosecutor's Office in Moldova. We're delighted to have him join us, and sir, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organisers of this 20th Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons, which marks the 20th anniversary of the Palermo Protocol and is taking place against the complex backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, I'd like to thank the OSCE team, and especially Mr. Valley and Ritchie, for the opportunity to share information and valuable experience with the other attendees at this very important conference. It's vital when it comes to tackling human trafficking. In terms of what goes on in Moldova, when it comes to adopting legislation and policy to improve the effectiveness of our system, I'd like to inform the conference participants that we have a coordinating council of law enforcement agencies which has powers to stop trafficking in persons. The council its establishment was based on our Prevention and Stopping Trafficking in Persons Act. It's chaired by the Prosecutor General, and it holds quarterly meetings. It focuses on improving the efforts of law enforcement agencies that work in this area, setting goals, and ensuring a unified approach by law enforcement agencies and unified legal norms. The council includes the Deputy Prosecutor General, the Prosecutor General from the Organised Crime Department, the Prosecutor General for Anti-Corruption, the Interior Minister, the Director of the Centre for Tackling Human Trafficking, the Director of our Information and Security Service, and the Head of the General Inspectorate for Border Police, as well as the General Anti-Corruption Centre and the Ministry of Justice. The council meetings see various people being invited. Sometimes they're representatives of NGOs or international organisations. And I'd like to clarify here that the council does not replace the Committee Against Trafficking in Persons, which is a government body. This council aims to improve the effectiveness of the work of law enforcement agencies when it comes to fighting trafficking in persons. The council includes the Prosecutor General for Anti-Corruption and the Director of the Anti-Corruption Centre, because one of the main problems when it comes to human trafficking is the involvement of civil servants in this activity, and they work for the organisations that are supposed to be tackling these crimes. The mechanism of the Coordinating Council makes that we have a more comprehensive approach to new forms of trafficking in persons. We can plan comprehensive approaches, we can come up with recommendations for the behaviour of each member of the council. And it's a concentration of efforts if we have complex cases. It means that we have a unified approach when it comes to categorising, investigating and cooperation. It can make proposals about how to develop our penal law, our criminal procedural code and other legal norms, and it allows for discussion. On this side you can see an organogram of the Prosecutor General's office in Moldova, and you can also see the specialised bureau and who's responsible for fighting trafficking in persons. Now I need to clarify here that the Prosecutor General's office has a department on human trafficking which addresses the coordination, monitoring, control and assistance of prosecutors when they're looking into such cases. As an example of what has been happening in this area, I can tell you about what happened in 2018 when the council identified some problems. There was a lack of a unified approach by courts when it came to looking into human trafficking related crimes. Based on an analysis carried out by the Prosecutor General's office along with several members of the council, it was established that often the lower courts were acquitting or recategorizing crimes. The appeal court and the high court later quashed several of the existing convictions, and then they found the defendants guilty of human trafficking related crimes, but some of the accused used the time, unfortunately, to hide from the authorities. It was also established that one of the reasons for these acquittals was a lack of training or specialisation on the part of judges. So the Coordination Council advised the Prosecutor General's office, as a member of the High Council of Magistrates, to press for judges from lower court and appeal courts to specialise. In 2018, the High Council of Magistrates approved the Prosecutor General's office's request regarding the specialisation of judges at a pilot project in the capital, and later in 2019, after an evaluation of the work of judges specialising in human trafficking cases, and after another request from the Prosecutor General's office in January 2020, that High Council recommended that judges throughout Moldova be specialised. It may seem to be a paradox, but this kind of specialisation actually requires very broad understanding. You need to know about the profile of the victim, you need to know about parallel financial investigations, the modus operandi of the criminal, right up to international cooperation. You need to know about profile of the traffickers, you need to know the psychology of the victim, trauma, Stockholm Syndrome. You need to understand how to cooperate with agencies that assist and rehabilitate those who have suffered due to human trafficking. It also entails understanding cooperation with international institutions, and you need to understand software so that you can operate on a professional level in the field. And these are all things that the courts need to understand and the judges who work in them need to know about. So at the forefront of our new methods, we have joint international investigations with the support of Interpol, Europol, Eurojust. Moldova was involved in several such investigations, carrying out investigations into human trafficking with a focus on psychological rehabilitation and financial support for the victims, the use of IT, continuing to provide professional development training to those who are involved in fighting THB when it comes to police, the prosecutors, courts, etc., developing the knowledge of the bodies such as Labour Inspectorate, the Customs and Excise Department, etc., so that they can help us in our efforts in developing national structures. Now, as for recommendations as to what to do in future, I would emphasise that it's important to establish committees or groups of parliamentarians who address issues of trafficking in humans based on the Council of Europe ideas, like in Romania, for example, developing national and international mechanisms for financial compensation to victims without any discrimination based on their origin, social status or language. International control agencies such as the US State Department or Greta need to, in their reports, have a special item and a focus on whether there is adequate state financing for preventing and tackling THB, holding seminars and training sessions focused on the most burning issues with regard to this field, and getting business, civil society and academia involved in gathering and analysing data, in formulating solutions to the problems of human trafficking. In conclusion, I would like to cite a line from Alfred Tennyson's Ulysses: to strive, to seek, to find, and not.
Thank you, Mr. Rusu. Not to yield, I concur, and thank you for your passionate and informative intervention, especially your highlighting of capacity building across all teams working on trafficking. This includes both those who are working on it maybe on a daily basis, such as judges, as you mentioned, and in particular developing expertise around working with victims, which I agree is a very complicated but important aspect. But also you mentioned something really important about engaging in capacity building of those departments not directly working on trafficking, such as labor inspectorates. It's not their primary function to combat trafficking, but they can help, as you said, the effort. So this is fantastic, as well as the committees to address issues and to try to brainstorm solutions. And I applaud your mention not only of parliaments, but of the private sector and civil society. This is a fantastic set of recommendations going forward. With that rich body of substance that we are left with from our panelists, I want to thank them so much for their contributions. We will turn to interventions from the floor. In just a second, I will turn it over to Holy See, followed by EU, and then Canada. And with that, I turn to the Holy See. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The works of this conference represent an important step for the OSCE and for the scope of the alliance. This is because, although it has focused on criminal justice and ending impunity, it has also considered more than just the seriousness of the criminal offense. It has also worked to address the violation of the human rights of victims of these crimes. Respect for human rights and the dignity of the person cannot be subordinate to any other purpose. They are the beacon to which political, judicial, and administrative action must refer. Respect for human dignity must serve not only to limit arbitrariness and the excess of the agents of the state, but act as a guiding criterion for the prosecution and punishment of those actions which represent the most serious attacks against the dignity and integrity of the human person. My delegation is convinced of the need to create a legislative system that focuses primarily on people and that takes into account and defends their inalienable human rights and fundamental freedoms. A legal system should ensure that the rights of the victims are not violated and offer them all necessary assistance, while monitoring the laws as they are applied to combat trafficking in human beings. In this regard, MC Decision 508 specifically encourages participating states to ensure that victims of human trafficking have access without delay to secure accommodation, psychological and medical treatment, and counseling regarding their legal rights and the services available to them. The need to work for the creation of this system coincides with the objectives of the Alliance meetings, for which we confirm the strong support of the ODC, sincerely thanking all those who contributed and worked for the success of the conference and for obtaining good results. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Holy See. I turn now to EU.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the speakers of this panel for sharing their recommendations to address the challenges we have discussed over last days. As previously mentioned, we believe that countering the culture of impunity is indeed a cornerstone of the long-term efforts to combat trafficking in human beings. The EU welcomes that the discussions of this year's Alliance conference stressed the importance of adopting a victim-centered approach, of improving victims' access to justice, and of working together for victims' rights, as well as the need to harness the potential of digital technologies in preventing and disrupting trafficking in human beings. Efficiently targeting trafficking in human beings requires close cooperation between all OSCE participating states, partners for cooperation, and actors of civil society. The EU therefore continues to highly value the Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons as an informal platform facilitating the combination and coordination of the efforts of all its partners. We are pleased that the format of this conference allowed the wide participation, not only of states, but also of relevant professionals such as prosecutors, judges, and law enforcement officials, of the private sector and of media actors and of the civil society. We welcome the exchanges of views and sharing of experience among all these important actors that took place over the past 3 days. We would like to thank the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for combating trafficking in human beings for organizing this conference, and we are looking forward to continuing these important conversations on the topic of trafficking of human beings, as combating of this heinous crime remains a priority for the EU. I thank you very much.
Thank you, and I turn now to Canada, followed by Mr. Aziz Mirajev of Uzbekistan. Canada, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ritchie, and thanks to the panelists for their presentation. As part of its national strategy to combat human trafficking, Canada is committed to increasing criminal justice system's capacity to identify and prosecute human trafficking cases. We are looking to strengthen the knowledge of law enforcement and prosecutors on the scope, scale, and sensitivities around human trafficking. This will help us to better identify cases and enhance consistency in prosecution. As part of this commitment, Canada intends to host an international conference that focuses on improving Canada's criminal justice system response to human trafficking cases. This conference will also be a way to share best practices and lessons learned with domestic and international partners. We have taken good notes of the discussion over the last days, and we will certainly draw from its conclusions. Although there is a great deal of uncertainty around the events, such as this one, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are aiming to hold the conference in the coming year. With regards to how national prosecution strategies can be more effectively tailored to provide enhanced prosecution, we would like to recommend that participating states consider providing trauma-informed care to victims and survivors as soon as possible, and providing training on the impact of trauma on victims and survivors to law enforcement and criminal justice practitioners. Finally, Canada's national strategy to combat human trafficking was developed based on the conclusion of a gender-based analysis plus, which contains gender perspective and enhancement of disproportionate impacts on certain vulnerable populations. The national strategy was also informed by the recommendation of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. As Mrs. Courtney Sky rightfully pointed out yesterday, due to systemic discrimination issues in our system, human trafficking in Canada is known to disproportionately affect women and girls and other vulnerable populations such as Indigenous women and girls. Youth living in alternative care settings, persons living with disabilities, LGBTQ2+ persons, and especially transgender youth, as well as migrants and immigrants, are also particularly at risk. We thank Mrs. Sky for her intervention yesterday. We have welcomed her comments with humility and determination to act. We also hope that the establishment of our new Survivor Advisory Committee will help us to amplify survivor voices in order to inform our policies and programs for the benefit of all victims, regardless of their gender, age, ethnicity, indigeneity, sexual orientation, or disability. The Government of Canada remains committed towards addressing the systemic violence that has resulted in a disproportionate rate of victimization among Indigenous women and girls in Canada. We recommend that all participating states of the OSCE assess the differential impacts of the potential policies or emergency responses on women and girls and vulnerable population, and adapt final policies and programs to their findings. During this pandemic, it is crucial to ensure that women and girls, as well as vulnerable population, have access to appropriate support services more than ever. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Canada. Thank you also for listening to survivors in your work in combating trafficking. And now I turn to Mr. Aziz Mirazayev of Uzbekistan, followed by the Smile of the Child.
Уважаемый господин спецпредставитель Вал Ричи, уважаемые коллеги, уважаемые друзья.
Colleagues, in 2019, we had a meeting with the Special Coordinator on THB and the SCO and others on specifically looking at THB. And just a week before this, we marked on 30th June, we proposed stepping up work to protect victims and to bring those responsible to justice. As by way of proposal, we would like to say, we suggest holding more conferences involving prosecutors, different bodies, and bringing the different people together to discuss all of this. Also to work with specialized literature on this issue, looking at legal practice, court practice in the different countries in the region. It's also important to hold forums with representatives of Central Asia, Turkey, the Caucasus countries, where we can discuss our court practice in this area, also taking into account the gender aspect and the resources we have available. At the OSCE, we have a case handbook. This is important. We think that we could discuss this, taking into account court practice in the OSCE area. It's not possible for any one country to tackle this problem, and so we support having an international commission on this. We will continue to develop our cooperation with the special representative, with ODIHR, and with the project office in Uzbekistan to continue working on effectively combating human trafficking. Even if we cannot completely eradicate this phenomenon, we can at least reduce this terrible scourge. Human trafficking is modern slavery, and we have to work together and work shoulder to shoulder to tackle this and exchange information. And thank you.
Thank you for your intervention and for recalling the Judges Conference in 2019, which gathered over 23 judges from over 23 participating states to discuss those issues. Thank you, sir. And now we turn to the Smile of the Child, followed by Humans for Humans.
I hope you can hear me.
We can.
Great. Mr. Chairman, as the largest civil society organization in Greece involved in child care and child protection, the Smile of the Child thanks you and your office for organizing also this year's Alliance meeting under difficult circumstances. Here are our remarks and recommendations for implementation in participating states and for active promotion by the Office of the Special Representative. Number one, the prosecution of trafficking is even more complex when the victim is a child. More needs to be done in this respect, more or less everywhere. A, legal basis allowing for adaptive procedures of investigation, interviewing, and judicial ruling in such a way that the child victim's trauma be not unnecessarily deepened and prolonged by repeated confrontations. B, investment in adapted infrastructure for the child victims interviewing and testifying. C, specific training of personnel at the level of the law enforcement and prosecutors on how to deal with child victims. Secondly, well-established, recognized civil society organizations, solidly rooted in local society and involved in child care and child protection, can crucially contribute to child-friendly justice. This implies that processes of case identification and eventually investigation, running up to court procedures, should structurally, yet in a flexible way, provide a role for civil society to contribute. Concretely, A, a prerequisite to secure straightforward cooperation of the child victim and to bring to a good end investigations and court procedures is the building of a trust relationship. Through their expertise in dealing with children, especially specialized civil society organizations are well placed to generate an environment, both physically and mentally, that gradually reduces trauma and builds trust in view of interviews and testimonies, decisive for the success of investigations and subsequent court cases. B, said civil society organizations should also be systematically and actively involved in the background assessment, often even more complex in the case of trafficking of children. And C, locally rooted civil society organizations of child care and child protection can substantially contribute to the sensitization and training personnel of law enforcement, prosecution, and judges with regard to the specific context of child victims of trafficking. We call upon participating states to embed this potential in their methods and practices. The Smile of a Child, for one, is generally involved in training of law enforcement personnel in Greece and remains committed to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Smile of the Child. And I turn now to Humans for Humans, followed by Steve Harvey.
Good day, everyone. I'm Christina Minieva. I'm a representative of Humans for Humans organization based in Oslo, in Norway. We are an NGO which provides a free mental health support for human trafficking survivors and professionals who work with them. So we work on 5 main directions. It's mental health, education, collaboration, projects, and research. We contribute to research by combining mental health and also human trafficking. First of all, we provide our psychologists with a specific training in trauma, for example. We attribute each psychologist to the survivor, and then we monitor and evaluate their interventions. We all know how important to educate general public about human trafficking, especially kids. We closely work with schools and we will provide them with the lectures about human trafficking, what human trafficking is, how to support human trafficking, whom to ask for help, and how not to be scared to ask for help. Moreover, we are building an online platform for online counseling all over the world because we understand the importance of native-speaking psychologists to the survivor. Moreover, we're trying to create a safe place not only for survivors, but also for professionals who work with them to using this platform for their internal team communication. One of our main goals is collaboration, and we strongly believe that we can fight this crime together by sharing our experience and knowledge. Now we have 2 main partners. It's ECPAT Norge in Norway and also APF in Portugal. You will find our presentation conference Dropbox, and thank you for the opportunity to take a floor here today.
Thank you very much. And I turn now to Steve Harvey, independent consultants. Mr. Harvey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valiant. Good day to everybody. Some of you may know me, others don't. I'm Steve Harvey, a former British police officer, 20 years counter anti-human trafficking practitioner, and former lead for Europol for 11 years on countering human trafficking in the EU member states. It's been a really interesting 3 afternoons, and I'm very grateful for the 2 minutes you've afforded me to just cover a couple of points on working practices. And forgive me, it's linked to my background, law enforcement, and it deals with investigations. Not every trafficking case is a cross-border inquiry or has an international element. Therefore, it follows that not every trafficking case requires special investigative measures, joint investigation teams, or mutual legal assistance, which are often presented as major challenges for agencies and states to combat trafficking effectively or at all. There are numerous local, domestic, national cases. I could walk 10 minutes from the Hofburg Palace there in Vienna and find a trafficking victim. We know every country represented in this event has a problem with trafficking. So therefore, we don't need to look beyond our borders to find victims. The issue is sensitizing our first responders with the sufficient training and awareness so that when they encounter a trafficking situation, they identify it for what it is. When I was a cop many years ago, there was a standard response to a narcotics bust or a rape inquiry or arson or a theft of a car. Officers knew automatically what they were dealing with and how to respond. That isn't the case with human trafficking. We still have many examples of police officers, guards, immigration officers, Coast Guard officials, etc., who cannot adequately describe what human trafficking is, often conflate human trafficking with people smuggling, and therefore are not in a position to respond effectively when they encounter a victim of trafficking or trafficking situation. So training is vital. And linked into training is the role of dedicated units, either multidisciplinary or just solely law enforcement from the outset, but those who have a mandate to engage with non-law enforcement and civil society. Good examples would be the Dutch Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment, the SDW, the UK's Gang Master Abuse Authority, and in Vienna you probably have the model agency with the Austrian Bundeskriminalamt Joint Operation Office, run by the excellent Gerhard Tatzgern, who many of you will be familiar with. These dedicated units have more success because they deliver a focused surgical response to human trafficking, backed up by experience and competence and access to all the service providers. So in brief, it's working practices that need to be addressed. It's elements of working practice from law enforcement, but also any other potential first responder that may be exposed to human trafficking issues. And it's linked to training. We cannot get away from training and education. It's the silver bullet. It starts there. And from a practitioner perspective, that is one of the key challenges that we face in the woeful level of prosecutions that we currently experience. More investigations will lead to more prosecutions, and more prosecutions leads to more familiarity and comfort within the judicial environment of actually prosecuting these trafficking cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey, and thank you in particular for highlighting and reminding us that there is a tremendous percentage of these cases which are domestic cases, and we certainly can't hide behind the challenges of international cooperation in trying to make headway on combating trafficking. Excellent point. And you have highlighted once again, I think as several of the speakers have, the value of dedicated specialized units can't be overemphasized. With that, I'm delighted to say that we have a couple minutes for questions. And so I'd like to pose a question to Mr. Rusu, and then I'm going to follow that with a question to Ms. Vasiliadou. So Mr. Rusu, I hope that you can hear me okay. But one of the questions that was raised was related to a topic you raised about labor inspectorates. And the question is, what are measures beyond training that states can take to improve the knowledge of trafficking adjacent actors? So these teams or departments that are not necessarily dedicated to trafficking, but trafficking adjacent, such as labor inspectorates, on how to identify trafficking cases. So I'm wondering if you could give us your thoughts on that in brief, please. Thank you. And the question is, what are measures beyond training that states can take to improve the knowledge of trafficking adjacent actors? So these teams or departments that are not necessarily dedicated to trafficking, but trafficking adjacent, such as labor inspectorates, on how to identify trafficking cases. So I'm wondering if you could give us your thoughts on that in brief, please. Thank you.
Yes. I believe that alongside the Labour Inspectorate, we also need to get others involved. For example, from the directorate that carries out labour evaluations in all areas where economic activity is engaged in. I think that it's possible to uncover criminal groups and companies that make use of the labour of victims of trafficking in persons.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's an excellent point about it's not only the training, but it's also the mandate of these associated actors. Do they have the authority to identify and look for trafficking, which is a question on labor inspectors that we often run into across the OSC. I'm going to turn in just a second to Ms. Vasiliadou, but I wanted to let Ms. Alvarez know that I will come to her next with a question as well. So Ms. Vasiliadou, the question is, you mentioned addressing the demand side of trafficking, and I was wondering if you could, the question that we have is if you could elaborate more concretely on why you believe there is a lack of political will to address the demand side and what could be done about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. Actually, what I did say is that we cannot afford to simply concentrate on the traffickers and the victims because there's a trafficking chain. And if we miss some of the actors in this chain, then we cannot appropriately address the crime. Let me reply with the quote again by Harari that I mentioned before. The slave trade was a purely economic enterprise, organized and financed by the free market according to the laws of supply and demand. I think, Val, this is about money. Like all profitable organized crime, the state money is laundered, some taxes are paid. There's a very complex relationship between trafficking, and a very straightforward relationship between trafficking and money. There is no trafficking without money. So I think what is very important to remember is the potential financial benefits, but also the accessibilities for the users to the services or the goods by the victims. It makes basically cheap and easy to rape someone. That's what it does, or to buy a t-shirt for that matter. So I think we cannot afford to undermine the profitability of the crime for the legal and irregular sectors as well.
Thank you very much. This last year, our office produced a publication on following the money, talking about financial investigations. And one of the things that comes to mind as you talk is following the money in both directions. Maybe that's something that we could think about, not only towards the traffickers, but where does that money come from? What's the source of the money in the first place? Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn to Ms. Alvarez. Ms. Alvarez, the question that was posed in our chat was, and this is related to your presentation around the Nigerian victim cases that you discussed. What are the most pressing and realistic steps that the EU must take with regard to preventing trafficking of migrant women, who, as we know, constitute the overwhelming majority of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation in Europe? Do you have any recommendations on steps that could be taken in that regard? The floor is yours. Victim cases that you discussed. What are the most pressing and realistic steps that the EU must take with regard to preventing trafficking of migrant women, who, as we know, constitute the overwhelming majority of victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation in Europe? Do you have any recommendations on steps that could be taken in that regard? The floor is yours.
En mi opinión, es muy importante que se adopten medidas, sobre todo
And to take measures above all about information in the countries of origin. It's very important to take part through economic efforts to raise awareness in the countries of origin about what they're likely to encounter when they come to our countries, when they come to Europe in general, what kinds of work offers they're dealing with, to carry out awareness campaigns in the countries of origin. This is essential. We also need to have measures, as we said, measures such as the Liaison magistrates, to be working with the countries of origin, to be working not just independently with each country separately, but also to be working through an institutionalized process.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alvarez, for that insightful response. And I wanted to also briefly address another question that I'm not going to pose to the panel, but I'll try to answer briefly myself, because it wasn't part of the original discussion, but it relates to some of the topics that were covered earlier in the conversations. And that question is that the presentations covering trafficking for sexual exploitation focus primarily on male buyers and female victims or survivors. What can be done, however, to improve prosecutions of cases involving the trafficking of boys and men for sexual exploitation? And this is, I think, a very insightful question. And interestingly enough, a couple of the speakers earlier in the conference highlighted the need to pay attention to the gender dynamics of this crime, both in terms of perpetrators, but also in terms of victims. And one of the things that needs to be done is to raise awareness among frontline responders, among civil society, and among investigators on what signs to look for and how to work with boys and men who might be victims. Certainly, there are a lot of cultural dynamics at play that can stand in the way of identifying male victims of trafficking, and proper training and awareness is a crucial first step in that regard. A second topic, though, that I think is worth raising and was addressed by one of the speakers earlier was the idea of actually focusing some operations around identifying those who would seek to harm boys or men, and conducting stings specifically targeting those populations. I think that that's one way that can help to identify the perpetrators. If our operations are skewed in our gender perspectives, we won't be identifying the certain segments of the perpetrators who need to be addressed as well. So I thank the chat for that question. And with that, we're going to draw this panel to a close. I want to just briefly thank again all of the panelists for their fantastic presentations and recommendations. I want to thank the robust chat for their questions and comments. And I want to thank the interventions from the floor, which were also very insightful. We're going to be back in approximately 30 minutes for the closing, and I'll be delighted to welcome Ambassador Igli Hassani of the Albanian Chair in Office, who will join me for closing remarks. So we'll see you at 1500 Vienna time. Thank you very much.